Well, good evening. How's everybody doing this evening? It is a pleasure and a blessing to see you all, as always. My name is Ben Flowers. Can't even say my own last name, for those of you that do not know me. Also, we have handouts back there on that small podium if you did not get one. And Ms. Judy is about to close that. Yes, she is. So, as we always like to do, before we get into to the lesson at all, I'd like to ask if anyone has any prayer requests. Miss Courtney has a praise. Let's hear it, please. Today is their ninth anniversary. Ninth anniversary. Bless you, bless you, bless you. You sure about that, John? No, I understand what you mean. I completely understand. Yes, completely understand what you mean. I completely, in this day and age, we need that blessing. We need that blessing. Any other praises? Any other praises? Yes, ma'am.
I want to thank the Lord. One of my really good friends, actually my best friend, last 4 or 5 years, she wasn't a Christian, but there's a lot of morally good people out there. And her family wasn't from around here. She really didn't have any friends, and so I just befriended her through our job. And she got diagnosed with cancer last year, but on the 20th, I was able to lead her to the Lord, and she passed away on Monday.
Home with the Lord. Did y'all hear that? That is a blessing. Absolutely, absolutely. Never too late, never too late. That's a blessing. Thank God for that. Any, yes, ma'am.
As a praise and a prayer request.
Praise and a prayer request.
Woods is getting better.
I'm sorry.
Charlene Woods is better, but she's still not too far.
So I did not know anything.
Some kind of chest congestion.
Okay, so Charlene Woods sits right over there. Yeah, I know. So she had chest congestion, and ended up going to the doctor, but she's getting better. She's getting better. She says she's getting better, so please continue to pray for Charlene Woods. Any other prayer requests? Praises. All righty. So I'm going to ask Brother Hugh, if you don't mind, if you would please open us in prayer, remembering Charlene and praying for tonight's lesson, if you would, brother.
Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we come to you, our Savior, our Redeemer. Thank you for the beautiful day that you created and allowed us to be a part of this beautiful day. Thank you for the rain that you sent our way. Thank you for the bless your word. Thank you for everything that you did to your people. Pray, Father, that we will never take that for granted. That we will always thank you.
Amen. So if you did not hear all of his prayer, one of the things he mentioned, we're going to talk about this later on, was not taking the Lord for granted. And we're going to talk about that as part of our lesson. Again, if you don't have a handout, they're back there on the podium. Starting out, I'm going to have you go ahead, if you would, please turn to the book of Numbers. It's not going to be anything on the slides or anything like that shown on the wall. So grab your Bible or the Bible on the pew in front of you and go ahead and turn to the book of Numbers. We'll be there in a minute, but I just want to go ahead and have you get there. So as an introductory question, I'd like to ask this. Do you have an item that is special to you? Do you have an item that is special to you? That is, do you use it for a specific purpose, a specific occasion, and no one, absolutely no one, is allowed to use it at any other time. That item could be said to be set apart, to be separated, or to be consecrated for that purpose. Could be dishes, Christmas dishes, Thanksgiving dishes. For guys, ladies, could be a fishing pole. Maybe you've got one of those 12-foot long fishing rods, and you use that thing when you're out there in the surf on tops of a little surf city or something like that. And at no other time you use that, but when you go there, that's when you use it. It is set apart, separated, or consecrated for that specific purpose. Our lesson tonight, as we've seen, is Samson. It's a lesson on consecration. And this should be on your paper, the handout that you have. From Wikipedia, the definition of consecration says this: consecration is the transfer of a person or a thing to the sacred sphere for a special purpose or service. The word consecration literally means association with the sacred. Persons, places, or things can be consecrated. And the term is used in various ways by different groups. Okay. Our lesson tonight, of course, being Samson, comes from the book of Judges. I'm not going to talk about the book of Judges in detail because we all have been through that with Pastor Robert, and I trust that we understand where we are in the book of Judges. But there are a couple of things I do want to point out from that. The theme of the book of Judges, or one of the themes in the book of Judges, is this. And Josh, he's not in here, he's elsewhere this evening. But he and I were talking about this Sunday night, how that chapter 17, verse 6, I'm going to mention that in a second, and the very last chapter in the book of Judges says this. It says, in those days there was no king in Israel, but every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Pastor Robert, just on the handout last week, he said this, the handout says this: God blesses, this is the cycle that they were in the book of Judges. God blesses, Israel sins. God judges, Israel repents. God delivers and gives rest, and then Israel sins again. That's the cycle, the never-ending cycle throughout the book of Judges. Then, like I said, it ends with that the verse that I just quoted. So as part of our background also, we're going to be talking about, again, Samson and his hair, and of course things dealing with that, and the Nazirite vow. So to give us an understanding of the Nazirite vow, that's why I had you turn to the book of Numbers. Numbers chapter 6. We're going to read about the Nazirite vow so that we have a better understanding of Samson and the vow that he took. Numbers chapter 6 and verse 1 says this: And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When either man or woman shall separate themselves to vow a vow of a Nazirite, to separate themselves unto the Lord. Now let me say there, and I know I'm pausing in mid-sentence, but I want to explain this. The vow was strictly voluntary. Strictly voluntary, okay? You did not have to do this. This is strictly voluntary. To separate themselves unto the Lord. He shall separate himself from wine and strong drink, and shall drink neither vinegar or no vinegar of wine. And by the way, I'm reading from the King James. No vinegar of wine or vinegar of strong drink. Neither shall he drink any liquor of grapes, nor eat moist grapes or dried. All the days of his separation shall he eat nothing that is made of the vine tree, from the kernels even to the husk. All the days of the vow of his separation, there shall no razor come upon his head, until the days be fulfilled, in the which he separated himself unto the Lord. He shall be holy, and shall let the locks of his hair, of the hair of his head, grow. All the days that he separated himself unto the Lord, he shall come at no dead body. He shall not make himself unclean for his father, or for his mother, for his brother, or for his sister, when they die, because the consecration of his God is upon his head. All the days of his separation he is holy unto the Lord. If there was one word that you should remember, and this is on your paper, from that passage, it is the word what? What word is it? What word jumps out to you more than any other from that passage I just read? Consecrated or separate. I said it several times. Consecrated or separate. And by the way, thank you, Miss Courtney. They both mean the same thing. Separation and consecrate, or separated and consecrate. The Hebrew word is nezer, N-E-Z-E-R, and it means the same exact thing, either separated or consecrated, okay? So now with that as our backdrop, let's take a look at Samson, and we're, of course, going to begin with the birth of Samson. The birth of Samson. And if you would please turn over in the book of Judges to chapter 13. Judges chapter 13. For the rest of the evening, we're going to be in chapters 13, 14, 15, and then we will land in chapter 16 and hang out there for the rest of the remainder of the evening. Judges chapter 13. We're going to be looking at verses 1 to 5. Judges 13, verses 1 to 5. Verse 1 says this, "And the children of Israel did evil again in the sight of the Lord." Remember the cycle? "And the Lord delivered them into the hand of the Philistines for 40 years. And there was a certain man of Zorah of the family of the Danites whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren and bare not. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto the woman and said unto her, Behold now, thou art barren and bearest not, but thou shalt conceive and bear a son. Now therefore beware, I pray thee, and drink not wine nor strong drink, and eat not any unclean thing. For lo, thou shalt conceive and bear a son, and no razor shall come on his head. For the child shall be a Nazarite unto God from the womb, and he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines." Now, if you would please, drop down to verses 24 and 25. Judges 13, verse 24 says this, "And the woman bare a son, and called his name Samson. And the child grew, and the Lord blessed him. And the Spirit of the Lord began to move him at times in the camp of Dan between Zorah and Eshtaol." So just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, Dan is in the far northern kingdom, of course, Beersheba down south. So he's up in that northern region of the land of Israel. So that's the birth of Samson. By the way, unless I'm mistaken, there are 3 people in Scripture whose births are foretold. One we just read about, Samson. Anyone want to take a guess as to the other 2? The Sunday school answer is the correct one, so you can go ahead and get that one. Who's that? Very good. Who's the third one? Anybody want to take a shot? John the Baptist. John the Baptist. His is foretold as well. Okay? So, moving on. So we go from the birth of Samson to the bride requested by Samson. That's Judges 14, verses 1 to 4. Judges 14, verses 1 to 4. Verse 1, chapter 14 says this, "And Samson went down to Timnath and saw a woman in Timnath of the daughter of the Philistines. And he came up and told his father and his mother and said, I have seen a woman," I bet you have, "I have seen a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore get her for me to wife." Then his father and his mother said unto him, "Is there never a woman among the daughters of thy brethren or among all my people, that thou goest to take a wife of the uncircumcised Philistines?" And Samson said unto his father, "Get her for me, for she pleaseth me well." Now, I think the fact that his parents say to him, "Is there never a woman?" It seems to me that Samson was always in the habit of making poor choices regarding women. That's why his parents said it. That's just my opinion. Verse 4, "But his father and his mother knew not that it was of the Lord that he saw an occasion against the Philistines, for at that time the Philistines had dominion over Israel." Drop down, if you would, please, to verse 7. It says, "And he went down," he that is Samson, "went down and talked with the woman, and she pleased Samson well." Now, you stay where you are. I'm going to turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 7. I want you to listen to this. Chapter 7, verse 1, I'm reading. "When the Lord thy God shall bring thee into the land whither thou goest to possess it, and hath cast out many nations before thee, the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than thou, and when the Lord thy God shall deliver them before thee, thou shalt smite them, utterly destroy them. Thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor show mercy unto them. Neither shalt thou make marriages with them. Thy daughter thou shalt not give unto his son, nor his daughter shalt thou take unto thy son. For they will turn away thy son from following me, that they may serve other gods. So will the anger of the Lord be kindled against you, and destroy thee suddenly. But thus shall you deal with them. You shall destroy their altars, break down their images, and cut down their groves, and burn their graven images with fire." So, we already see that Samson is doing something that he has no business doing in messing with strange women. That's the bride requested by Samson. Now we're going to see the breaking of the Nazirite vow by Samson. That's Judges chapter 14, verse 5. We talked about this, a little bit of this earlier. Read this again. Samson went down and his father and his mother to Timnath and came to the vineyards of Timnath. On your paper, you have this quote from Warren Wisdom, and it says this: a vineyard was a dangerous place for a man who was not supposed to have anything to do with grapes. If you're not supposed to have anything to do with grapes, stay away from vineyards. Chapter 14, verses 8 and 9, if you would, please. And after a time, he returned to take her, and he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion. So we see, verse 5, we talked about the vineyard. Verse 6 talked about the fact that the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. We're going to hit on that a little bit later on. He tore the lion up. So now we have a dead lion. Verse 8 again. And after a time, he returned to take her, and he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion. And behold, there was a swarm of bees and honey in the carcass of the lion. And he took thereof in his hands and went on eating. Came to his father and mother, and he gave them, and they did eat. But he told not them that he had taken the honey out of the carcass of a lion. So we talked about the fact that he's already in the beginning stages of breaking his Nazirite vow. That's the vow broken. Now we're going to see the brawn bestowed upon Samson. This is very important. The brawn, or the strength, bestowed upon Samson. Judges chapter 14, verses 5 and 6. We've already read verse 5. Notice this from verse 6. I'm not going to read the entire thing. I just want to point this out to you. Verse 6. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and he performed a certain feat. Drop down to verse 19, if you would, please. Verse 19 says this: and the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he performed another feat. You see the theme? Go over to chapter 15 and verse 14. Chapter 15 and verse 14. And it says this: and when he came to Lehi, the Philistines shouted against him, and again the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him. So we see the strength, or the brawn, that was bestowed upon Samson by who? Who? By God, the Spirit of God. It did not come from himself. Now, it is highly unlikely that Samson looked like the Arnold Schwarzenegger of the day. It's highly unlikely that he did so. He probably looked like a normal man, which is no doubt why his strength was such a mystery. If he looked like Arnold Schwarzenegger, one of these bodybuilders, it would have been easy to look at him and go, oh, okay, I see why this guy's strong. But he didn't. Chances are he didn't, okay? Now, so we've seen the brawn bestowed upon Samson. Now we're going to take a look at the banter, and that is the playfulness, the toyfulness, the joking, the banter displayed by Samson. This is on your paper, okay? Judges chapter 14, verses 12 to 15. Chapter 14, verses 12 to 15. I understand we're going back and forth, but I want you to see this flow in all these different things. Chapter 14, verse 12 says this: and Samson said unto them, I will now put forth a riddle unto you. So by the way, to give you a little bit of background. So we've already seen him going through he's already taken the bride, okay? With the bride came sort of a wedding party, and they're getting ready to celebrate this thing, okay? He and the Philistines, they're getting ready to celebrate this thing, of course, him getting married and all of this. Comes back to take the bride. So they're at this wedding party, or this wedding feast of sorts, if you will, okay? Verse 12. So Samson said to them, I'll now put forth a riddle unto you, if you can certainly declare it me within the 7 days of the feast. Now, where Samson got the idea of playing the riddle or doing the riddle, I have absolutely no idea. I have absolutely no idea. The Bible does not say. But he just came out with this riddle, okay? If you can declare it with me within the 7 days of the feast and find it out, then I will give you 30 sheets and 30 change of garments. But if you cannot declare it me, then shall you give me 30 sheets and 30 change of garments. And they said to him, put forth a riddle, that we may hear it. And he said to them, out of the eater came forth meat, and out of the strong came forth sweetness. And they could not in 3 days expound the riddle. And it came to pass on the 7th day that they said unto Samson's wife, entice thy husband, that he may declare unto us the riddle, lest we, get this, burn thee and thy father's house with fire. Nice people, right? Lest we burn thee and thy father's house with fire. Have ye called us to take that we have? Is it not so? In other words, you're in on this thing. It's a scheme. You're all devising to take away our belongings, okay? So that's the banter displayed by Samson. Everything was a game to Samson. Everything was a game. On your paper, Warren Wiersbe says this. He constructed this riddle out of the experience of his sin. Remember the carcass? He constructed this riddle out of the experience of his sin. It's bad enough to disobey God, but when you make a joke out of it, you've sunk to new depths of spiritual insensitivity. Now, we're going to see more of this playful attitude later on in chapter 15. So that was the banter displayed by Samson. Now we're going to take a look at the burning vengeance of Samson. You guys following okay? Everybody following all right? All right, good deal. Okay? The burning vengeance of Samson. That's Judges chapter 15, verses 1 to 5. You'll see why I call it the burning vengeance here in a second. But it came to pass within a while after, in the time of wheat harvest, that Samson visited his wife with a kid. And he said, I will go in unto my wife into the chamber. But her father would not allow him to go in. And her father said, I verily, or I truly thought that thou hast utterly hated her. Therefore I gave her to thy companion. Is not her younger sister fairer than she? Take her, I pray thee, instead of her. And Samson said concerning them, now shall I be more blameless than the Philistines, though I do them a displeasure. And Samson went and caught 300 foxes, and Warren Wiersbe says that those are probably jackals. What the difference is, I really don't know, but foxes are jackals. All right, we'll say that. 300 foxes. He wasn't alone in this. I'm sure he had help gathering these 300 foxes. And took firebrands and turned tail to tail and put a firebrand in the midst between two tails. And when he had set the brands on fire, he let them go into the standing corn of the Philistines and burn up both the shocks and also the standing corn with the vineyards and the olives. On your paper, Romans chapter 12, verse 19 says this, and you've heard this a gazillion times. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. So somebody out there is saying, well, that's New Testament. It's the book of Romans. Samson's an Old Testament. Well, guess what? It's in the book of Deuteronomy as well, which he should have had, the first 5 books. Deuteronomy 32:35 says this. This is, by the way, the song of Moses. Moses is getting ready to go off the scene, as you know, okay? So God told Moses, teach the children of Israel this song. That's all of chapter 32. Read that when you get a chance. Chapter 32, verse 35 says this. God says, to me belongeth vengeance and recompense. Their foot shall slide in due time. Speaking of his own and God's enemies. Their foot shall slide in due time. For the day of their calamity is at hand, and the things that shall come upon them make haste. So vengeance belongs to who? God the Lord, and the Lord alone. We need to remember that. We need to remember that. Now, I listed these for emphasis, and because it's hard not to exact revenge, especially when you have the means to do so, or the ability or the physical strength to do so, and as in Samson's case. It's hard not to exact revenge, but we need to remember to leave those things with the Lord. So we saw banter in chapter 14 and revenge at the beginning of this chapter. And in verses 7 to 16, we see both banter and revenge. Okay? Now, I'm not going to cover this because if there's a few things or anything that's known about Samson, it is his strength, his hair, and then what's the other one? The jawbone and the Philistines and the killing the 1,000. You guys know what I'm talking about, right? So we know that incident. It's as widely known as Daniel in the lion's den or David and Goliath. All right, so we know that one, okay? So we saw this, but I'm going to point something out from that incident with the killing of the 1,000 Philistines, okay? Talking about the playfulness. This is verse 16. And Samson said, with the jawbone of an ass, that is a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of an ass have I slain 1,000 men. Adrian Rogers and Warren Wiersbe pointed this out, and I didn't realize this, that this is actually somewhat of a rhyme, okay? Here's why. Donkey in Hebrew is Hamor, the word Hamor, Hamor, okay? Heaps in Hebrew is the word Homer. You guys remember that from our Old Testament studies, Homer, and now Homer. So you have a Hamor and a Homer. So here Samson is, he's whacking away and he's killing all these guys, right? So he looks over there and he sees a heap of Philistines lying there. He sees a Homer. In his hand, he sees a new jawbone of a donkey, which he shouldn't have been messing with in the first place, a new jawbone of a donkey, and he says, Hamor. So he says, a Hamor, a Homer, a Hamor, a Homer. And he starts this whole playfulness thing, right? You see where I'm going with that? All right, the whole thing. It's all a game to him, okay? All a game to him. All right, so that's the burning vengeance of Samson, all right? Now, we go from that, and the rest of our time, we're going to be in chapter 16, okay? And we see now the betrayal and the death of Samson. That's chapter 16, starting with verse 1. Chapter 16, starting with verse 1. And we're going to see, first of all, an inappropriate relationship. That's verses 1 to 3. Verse 16, chapter 16, verse 1, Then went Samson to Gaza, and there saw an harlot, and went in unto her. Look up here for a sec. That means exactly what you think it means. That means exactly what you think it means. That should shock all of us. Then went Samson to Gaza, and there saw there a harlot, and went in unto her, and was told the Gazites, saying, Samson is come hither, and they compassed him, or they circled him in, and laid wait for him all night in the gate of the city, and were quiet all the night, saying, In the morning, when it is day, we shall kill him. And Samson lay till midnight, and arose at midnight, and took the doors of the gate of the city, and the 2 posts, and went away with them, bar and all, and put them upon his shoulders, and carried them up to the top of an hill that is before Hebron. Okay? So, back to this harlot, the thing with the harlot. It's shameful, absolutely shameful, that a man who could be so mightily empowered of God to defeat the enemy of his people would see no need to appropriate that same power, the Spirit of God that is, when it came to conquering his flesh. Also, like so many men and women of God who are given to the desires of the flesh, we see that Samson is not only carnal, but he's also indiscriminate. That's dangerous. He's indiscriminate. So that's the inappropriate relationship. Now we're going to see an ill-advised affection that led to an ill-fated relationship. That's chapter 16, verses 4 to 24. And it came to pass afterward, after this incident with the harlot, that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. Proverbs chapter 22, verse 14 in the King James says this, The mouth of strange women is a deep pit. He that is abhorred of the Lord shall fall therein. As I was reading this, I thought to myself, abhorred, is that hated? I said, no, that doesn't make sense because the Lord didn't hate Samson. So I started doing some reading on it, right? The Hebrew word for abhorred is Z-A-A-M, okay? And it's similar to another Hebrew word. They're both spelled the same. It's all a matter of where you put the emphasis, where you put it on the first half of the word, za'am, or the last half, za'am, all right? They're both spelled the same, okay? Z-A-A-M, okay? Basically, it speaks of God's displeasure with sin. God's displeasure with sin. Does anyone in here use the English Standard Version or the ESV? Anybody use that? Okay. No, you have it? Is that what you're reading from? Do me a favor. Read that verse, that same verse, Proverbs 22:14 from the ESV. I want you guys to listen to this. And shout loud so we can all hear it. 22:14. Say that last part again, please. Did everybody hear that? Okay. Because the Spirit of God is omniscient and knows the end of this story, I can almost sense the grief that he feels over Samson at this point because he knows that this will lead to his death. And such is the case for any child of God who is bent on living for the flesh. Proverbs chapters 2, chapter 5, chapter 6, and certainly chapter 7. Please read that when you get a chance. Chapter 7. They all speak of the dangers of sexual sin and its damning consequences. This is something we're all prone to commit yet we're all prone to take lightly. Verse 5. And the Lord of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, entice him and see wherein his great strength lies, and by what means we may prevail against him, that we may bind him to afflict him. And we will give thee every one of us 1,100 pieces of silver. And Delilah said to Samson, tell me, I pray thee, wherein thy great strength lieth, and wherewith thou mightest be bound to afflict thee. So we're told in verse 4 that Samson loved Delilah, but there's nothing here or anywhere in this narrative that says she loved him. And the fact that she immediately sought to gain the answer to their dilemma says to me that she didn't. As a side note, it's a shame that Samson's relationship to the Lord wasn't as widely known as his feats of strength. So here's the question I have for you. Are we known more for our sense of humor or our ability to fix cars or our ability as a financial planner or as a motivational speaker, etc., you fill in the blank, than we are for our relationship with the Lord? Verse 7, Samson said to her, well, if they bind me with 7 green withs that were never dried, then shall I be weak and be as another man. As alarming as it is that Delilah would want to know the secret of his strength so that he might be afflicted, it's even more alarming that Samson wouldn't see the danger in such a question, but rather would toy around by giving playful answers. Verse 8, then the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 green withs, which had not been dried, and she bound him with them. Now there were men lying in wait, verse 9, abiding with her in the chamber. And she said to them, the Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And he brake the withs as a thread of tow is broken when it touches the fire. So his strength was not known. And Delilah said to Samson, behold, thou hast mocked me and told me lies. Now tell me, I pray thee, wherewith thou mightest be bound. So this woman, I'll be nice, this woman has the unmitigated gall, and as I was thinking about this in my study, the older generation, I'm going to use my mom as an example and some of the ladies that she grew up with. They had names for certain loose women. When I'm not talking about the cursing, the no, that wasn't even thought of. I'm just talking different words. I'm not going to repeat any of them, but if you remember some of the terms that used to be used for just floozies and things like that, loose women, these are the terms that they use. Now, guys didn't do this. This was ladies talking about other ladies, okay? So anyway, so these are the things that went through my mind, crazy as I think about things like that. So this woman has the unmitigated gall to say that Samson has mocked her and told her lies. All the while, what is she doing? She is plotting with the Philistines to bind and afflict him. Pathetic. And he said to her, well, if they bind me fast with new ropes that were never occupied or never used, then shall I be weak and be as another man. Delilah therefore took new ropes and bound him therewith. And she said to him, the Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And there were liars in wait, abiding in the chamber. So they were hiding out. And he brake them off his arms like a thread. So verse 8 tells us that the Philistines brought her green withs, but we read here that she herself took new ropes and she bound Samson, who still sees this all as nothing but a game. Verse 13, Samson said to Delilah, hitherto you've mocked me and told me lies. Tell me wherewith thou mightest be bound. And he said to her, well, if thou weavest the 7 locks of my head with a web, period. If you weave the 7 locks of my head, and he stops right there. Now, this may seem like a minor issue, but I find it interesting that he simply says, if you weave the 7 locks, but he never says, then shall I be weak, as he did before. You remember that? And every other time he said, then I shall be weak as another man. Now, why is that? Why do I point that out? Because in my opinion, he's already weakened. He's already weakened. She fastened it with a pin. She said to him, the Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And he awaked out of his sleep and went away with the pin of the beam and with the web. Now, although he hasn't given her the full answer at this time, he's getting closer to that which he believes to be the source of his strength. Because now he's talking about what? Talking about his hair. She said to him, how canst thou say, I love thee, when thine heart is not with me? Thou hast mocked me these 3 times, and hast not told me wherein thy great strength lies. So here's a red flag, if there ever was one. Beware of those who want you to give your heart, that is your loyalty, to them in love, yet they openly show that they are not willing to do the same. My Bible tells me that I am to love the Lord with all of my heart, but it also plainly declares that he loved me first. That's 1 John 4:19. Also, beware of those who seek to know what it takes to bring you down, rather than seeking to know and to do that which builds you up. Verse 16, and it came to pass when she pressed him daily with her words and urged him, so that his soul was vexed to death, that he told her all his heart. And he said to her, there's not come a razor upon my head, for I've been a Nazarite unto God from my mother's womb. If I be shaven, then my strength will go from me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man. Now, we already saw that his strength came from the Spirit of God rather than his hair. But just like so many of us today, we assume that our supernatural ability, that is our spiritual gifts, have something to do with that which pertains to our flesh. Verse 18, and when Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called for the lords of the Philistines, saying, come up this once, for he has showed me all his heart. Then the lords of the Philistines came up unto her and brought money in their hand. I don't know exactly what this means, but there's something that Samson either said or did that let Delilah know beyond a shadow of a doubt that he has shown her all of his heart. If this lesson teaches nothing else, it teaches me that we must be careful who we show and give our hearts to. Those who truly love us will cherish the act, but those who don't love us will do just as Delilah did and use it to betray us. Verse 19, and she made him sleep upon her knees, and she called for a man, and she caused him to shave off the 7 locks of his head, and she began to afflict him, and his strength went from him. This just hit me today as I was going over this lesson again. These 4 stages, she made him sleep on her knees. She called for a man. She caused him to they're given in, I guess what they call staccato fashion, or just given in rapid fashion. It makes me think that she didn't waste any time doing this. She did this thing right away, okay? She did this thing right away. So making him sleep, calling for a man, causing the man to shave Samson's, and her then afflicting him. So these are the 4 acts that this woman commits, and every single one of them was for the purpose of Samson's downfall. In other words, she was more of an enemy to him than the Philistines, okay? Proverbs chapter 23, verses 26 to 28. Listen to this. My son, this is Solomon speaking, of course. My son, give me thine heart, and let thy eyes observe my ways. For a whore is a deep ditch. Ow. That's strong language, right? And a strange woman is a narrow pit. Listen to this. She also lieth in wait as for a prey, and increases the transgressors among men. And she said, the Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And he awoke out of his sleep, and he said, I will go out as at other times before, and shake myself. And he wist not, King James, or as he knew, and he knew not that the Lord was departed from him. The latter portion of verse 19 tells us that Samson's strength went from him. And here we see that the Lord departed from him. This begs the question, is it at all possible that when Samson told Delilah about his Nazirite vow to God, we read that he also told her how he felt about that vow and about his hair? In other words, did he tell her that it wasn't really that important to him? Case in point, God has never departed from any man, woman, boy, or girl because of their hair or lack thereof. okay? Calmer, some of us, right? Or lack thereof. But he has departed, Ichabod. You guys remember that? Eli, the temple and all of that. Ichabod, from many an individual who has made it known that he is not vital to them and that he and he alone is the source of their strength. Verse 21, but the Philistines took him, put out his eyes, and brought him down to Gaza, and bound him with fetters of brass, and he did grind in the prison house. This quote is anonymous. We don't know who gave it, but it's a good one. It says this verse reminds us of the blinding, binding, and grinding results of sin. Verse 22, howbeit the hair of his head began to grow again after he was shaven. So this again is interesting because it makes me wonder how long his hair had to get before God saw fit to endue him with the strength he had before. We don't know. It's my personal opinion that this fact is given because unlike before, now get this, Samson now cherished the fact that his hair was growing, and for perhaps the first time in his life, he realized what it meant to God. Furthermore, this act of grace reminds me of Jonah chapter 3, verse 1, which says this, beautiful words, and the word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time. You guys remember that? As a side note, the Philistines had to be some of the dumbest people on the planet in order to allow his hair to grow again, right? Unless they didn't believe his hair had anything to do with his strength in the first place. Verse 23, then the lords of the Philistines gathered them together for to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god. That's the half fish, half man god that they made. And to rejoice, for they said, our God hath delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hand. And when the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, our God has delivered into our hands our enemy, and the destroyer of our country, which slew or which killed many of us. So this gathering had but one purpose and one purpose only, and that was to say that their God was superior to our God. Will God allow such gloating to take place without judgment? Absolutely not. So we go from there to seeing, lastly, an ignominious death. An ignominious death. That's verses 25 to 31. Merriam-Webster gives this definition of ignominious. It says this, that which is marked with or characterized by disgrace or shame, dishonorable, deserving of shame or infamy, despicable, humiliating, degrading. Verse 25, and it came to pass when their hearts were merry, this is the Philistines, of course, when their hearts were merry, that they said, call for Samson that he may make us sport. They called for Samson out of the prison house, and he made them sport, and they set him between the pillars. Galatians chapter 6, verse 7 says this, and you know this well. Be not deceived, God is not mocked. Whatsoever a man sows, help me out, that shall he also reap. Okay? It's interestingly ironic that the man who at one time played around and made sport of the Philistines is now called to make sport for them against his will. Verse 26, Samson said to the lad that held him by the hand, suffer me or allow me that I may feel the pillars whereupon the house standeth, that I may lean upon them. Now the house was full of men and women, and all the lords of the Philistines were there. And there were upon the roof about 3,000 men and women that beheld while Samson made sport. And Samson called unto the Lord and said, O Lord God, remember me, I pray thee, and strengthen me, I pray thee, only this once. O God, that I may be at once avenged of the Philistines from my two eyes. So this is the first and the only time in this narrative, this entire narrative, that Samson actually calls upon the Lord for strength. Every other time, he simply assumed it would be there. Question, have you ever gotten up to teach or to sing with that same presumptive attitude? Have you ever gotten up to teach Sunday school, a lesson Wednesday night, whatever the case may be, or to sing a song for the Lord? Got some singers in here, myself. Have you ever gotten up to do that and just assumed that the strength would be there to do it? I hope not. Verse 29, Samson took hold of the two middle pillars upon which the house stood, and on which it was borne up, of the one with his right hand, of the other with his left. And Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." And he bowed himself with all his might, and the house fell upon the lords and upon all the people that were therein. So the dead which he killed at his death were more than they which he killed in his life. Then his brethren and all the house of his father came down, took him, brought him up, and buried him between Zor and Ashtob, back where he was from, his hometown, in the burying place of Manoah his father. And he judged Israel for 20 years. So that's the lesson. That is the lesson. But before I let you go, I want to give, if I can, 3 points of application, 2 questions and 1 warning. First question, back to Brother Hugh's prayer in the beginning. Do you appreciate the relationship you have with Christ, or do you take him for granted? Again, do you appreciate the relationship you have with Christ, or do you take him for granted? That's a question that only you can answer. Second question, have you become insensitive to sin? Have you personally become insensitive to sin? Years ago, and thank God it's actually gotten better now, I guess I ran into a coffee table or something like that. You ever done that before? You run into a coffee table, hits the shin and that whole thing, all right? And you lose your religion, as it's almost, all right? But you run into the coffee table. And on my shin, front of my shin, I had a scar probably about that long, about that wide, okay? And for years, and I could run my finger across that, and I simply could not feel it. That area was just dead for whatever reason. But thank God it's healed now. I guess the nerves had to rejoin and all that business like that. Rhonda could probably tell us the whole, the history behind all that and how that works. But she's a nurse, by the way, in case you didn't know. But I could not feel. If I would run my finger, even fingernail, I could not feel it. It was insensitive to touch. I couldn't feel that. So back to our question. Have you become insensitive to sin? Guys, you're at work. Some pretty gal walks by. All the guys are sitting there and they talk about to make a comment about her. And you say, hey, well, after all, I'm a man, right? Is that you? Ladies? Well, a girl's got to have her fun. Is that us? Have we become insensitive to sin? I hope not. Lastly, 2 questions, and here's the warning. Beware. For every Samson out there, and I'm talking guys and gals, you get the idea. Every Samson type, every Samson out there, there is a Delilah who desires to do that which would bring you down. Rather than accommodating them, do as Joseph did and what? Run. Avoid them. Don't accommodate them. Avoid them altogether. Do whatever you need to do to get away. This altar is here, or yours at home, if you need to do business with God concerning these things. Questions? Comments? Very good. Brother Paul, if you don't mind, if you would you close us in prayer?
Father, we heard your word. Praise you for your goodness to us this day. Teach us how to live as you taught. Ask you to watch over the peace, but to go over the next way.
Amen. Good night.